History is not a straight line, it is a cycle of echoes. Today we walk through the sun-bleached ruins of the Mediterranean, looking at the silent stones of Mycenae and the crumbling temples of the Hittites. To the modern eye, these are just relics. But 3,000 years ago, they were the skyscrapers of a world that believed it would last forever. In the year 1200 BC, humanity had reached a peak. A sophisticated, globalized network of superpowers traded gold from Egypt, tin from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, and olive oil from the Greek hills. They had diplomacy, massive bureaucracies, and professional armies. They were invincible. And then, in the blink of an historical eye, they were gone. Cities burned, writing disappeared, great kings were reduced to legends, and for 400 years the world went silent. This wasn't a slow decline. It was a cliff. Welcome to Relic of History. Today we exhume the corpse of the Bronze Age to ask the most terrifying question in archaeology. How does a world-ending catastrophe actually begin? To understand the fall, we must first understand the height. The Late Bronze Age was the first modern era. If you could travel back to 1300 BC, you wouldn't find isolated tribes. You would find an interconnected web of empires that mirrored our own 21st century economy. At the heart of this world was a single vital resource: bronze. To make bronze, you need two things: copper and tin. Copper was easy to find in Cyprus, but tin? Tin was the oil of the ancient world. It was rare. It had to be transported across thousands of miles of dangerous sea and mountain passes. This created the first international supply chain. In the palaces of Hattusa, the Hittite king wrote letters to the pharaoh of Egypt, calling him "my brother." They sent each other wedding gifts, doctors, and architects. They signed the world's first peace treaties, like the Treaty of Kadesh in 1258 BC. They believed that because they were so dependent on one another, war was too expensive to wage. They thought their interdependence was their greatest strength. They were wrong. That very connection, that perfect web of trade, was actually a fuse. And in the late 13th century BC, someone or something lit it. To understand the tragedy of the collapse, we must look at the faces of the men who lost everything. These were not just kings. They were considered living gods. In the south, there was Egypt, ruled by the 19th dynasty. By 1213 BC, the legendary Ramses the Great had passed away, leaving behind a land of staggering wealth, but a military exhausted by decades of war. To the north, in modern-day Turkey, stood the Hittite Empire. They were the masters of iron and chariot warfare. Their capital, Hattusa, was a fortress of stone built into the mountains. In 1237 BC, King Tudhaliya IV sat on the throne, ruling over a kingdom that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the gates of Mesopotamia. And across the water, the Mycenaeans of Greece. These were the men of the Iliad, Agamemnon and Achilles. They lived in cyclopean palaces, with walls so thick the later Greeks believed only giants could have built them. They were the titans of the age. But they all shared one fatal flaw: fragility. Their systems were so complex that if one gear stopped turning, the entire machine would grind to a halt. In the year 1190 BC, the gears didn't just stop, they were shattered. Every great ruin begins with a single crack. By the mid-13th century BC, the relics of history show us that the foundation of the Bronze Age was already splintering. It wasn't just war that threatened these empires, it was a silent, internal decay. First, there was the economic crisis. Because these empires were so interconnected, they suffered from what modern economists call systemic fragility. The kings had become obsessed with monumental building projects, vast temples and golden tombs that drained the royal treasuries. To pay for them, they taxed their farmers into poverty. We find records of debt slavery skyrocketing in the years leading up to 1200 BC. The people who grew the food were losing their land, and with it, their loyalty to the crown. Then, there was the political decay. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, royal families began to tear themselves apart. Assassinations and coups became common as princes fought over a shrinking pie of resources. The great kings were no longer looking at the horizon for threats. They were looking over their shoulders at their own courts. But perhaps the most telling relic of this rot is found in the Amarna letters and the diplomatic archives of Ugarit. We see a shift in the tone of the tablets. The polite language of brotherhood is replaced by desperate pleas. In one tablet, a local governor writes to the pharaoh, begging for grain to feed a starving population. In another, a king complains that his trade routes have gone silent. The global supply chain was breaking. The world was starving, the gold was running out, and the people were angry. The stage was set. All it needed was a spark to burn the entire Mediterranean to the ground, and that spark was about to arrive from the darkest corners of the earth. For decades, historians believed the Bronze Age collapsed simply because of war. But the relics tell a different and far more terrifying story. Ancient people believed their gods had turned against them. Modern science tells us they were right. The earth itself was revolting. In the decades surrounding 1200 BC, a phenomenon known as an earthquake storm struck the Mediterranean. This wasn't just one quake. It was a series of tectonic shifts that lasted 50 years. We see the evidence in the relics. Cracked stone walls in Mycenae that shifted 3 feet off their foundations, and skeletons in the Hittite city of Troy found pinned under fallen masonry. These quakes didn't just kill people. They leveled the fortresses that the kings relied on for protection. The invincible walls were now rubble. But the earthquakes were only the beginning. The true killer was silent. It was a mega drought. By analyzing pollen samples from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and tree rings from ancient cedar forests, scientists have discovered a horrific truth. A 300-year dry spell began exactly at the peak of the Bronze Age. The rains stopped. The Nile failed to flood. The wheat fields of Anatolia turned to dust. In an era where 90% of the population were farmers, a drought of this scale meant only one thing: mass starvation. This was the perfect storm. A world already rotting from corruption was now being shaken by the earth and starved by the sun. The great empires were no longer concerned with trade or diplomacy. They were fighting for a crust of bread. And it was in this moment of absolute vulnerability that a shadow appeared on the horizon. Thousands of ships were coming, and they weren't coming to trade. Imagine standing on a coastal watchtower in the year 1190 BC. You look out at the Mediterranean, a sea that for centuries had brought wealth and brotherhood. But today, the horizon is jagged with thousands of sails. You don't recognize the ships. You don't recognize the armor. These are not traders. These are the sea peoples. Who were they? To this day, they remain one of history's greatest enigmas. They were a confederation of seafaring raiders: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, and the Dinian. For a long time, historians thought they were just barbarians. But the relics suggest something far more tragic. These were likely refugees, displaced by the same droughts and earthquakes we just explored, turning into a desperate, unstoppable tidal wave of warriors. They didn't just raid, they migrated. They brought their families, their wagons, and their cattle. They had nothing left to lose, which made them the most dangerous force on earth. They moved like a scythe across the coast of the Levant. Our best relic of their appearance comes from the walls of Medinet Habu in Egypt. There, in massive stone reliefs, we see them. Warriors wearing strange feathered headdresses, carrying round shields and long bronze swords. They fought with a ferocity the professional royal armies couldn't match. One by one, the great coastal cities began to go dark. In the city of Ugarit, the king sent a final, frantic letter to Cyprus. It reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The letter was never sent. It was found in the ruins of the city, still in the kiln where it was fired. Ugarit was destroyed before the clay could even cool. The shadow on the sea was no longer a rumor. It was a reality, and it was heading straight for the last standing superpower of the world, the Kingdom of Egypt. The end didn't happen in a year. It happened in a heartbeat. Between 1210 BC and 1175 BC, the map of the known world was erased. If you look at the relics of this era, you see a terrifying pattern, a layer of ash. In city after city, archaeologists find a thick, black line in the soil, the signature of total destruction. The first domino to fall was Mycenaean Greece. By 1200 BC, the great palaces of Pylos and Mycenae were in flames. These weren't just raided, they were abandoned. The complex Greek script, Linear B, simply stopped being used. In less than a decade, the Greeks forgot how to write. They fled into the mountains, leaving behind their gold and their gods. Next was the Hittite Empire. This was the superpower of the north, the masters of iron. In 1190 BC, the capital city of Hattusa was put to the torch. But here is the mystery. There are no bodies in the streets. It seems the Hittites knew the end was coming. They packed up their royal archives, abandoned their massive stone temples, and vanished into the fog of history. The greatest empire of the Bronze Age didn't just fall, it evaporated. Then came the cities of the Levant. Ugarit, 1185 BC, Hazor, 1175 BC, Lachish, 1160 BC. One by one, the lights of civilization were being snuffed out. The trade routes that had sustained the world for 1,000 years were now ghost road. By 1177 BC, the dominoes had reached the final border. The Hittites were gone. The Greeks were gone. The Cypriots were gone. Only one empire remained standing, staring across the Mediterranean at the approaching sails of the sea peoples. The pharaoh Ramses III stood on the banks of the Nile, knowing that if Egypt fell, the memory of humanity might fall with it. The year is 1177 BC. The world has ended everywhere else, and now the apocalypse has reached the gates of Egypt. Pharaoh Ramses III is not just fighting for his crown, he is fighting for the survival of the last beacon of civilization. The sea peoples didn't just come by water, they came by land too. A massive land army of warriors and their families moved down the coast, while their fleet aimed for the mouth of the Nile. Egypt was trapped in a pincer movement, but Ramses was a master of strategy. He knew he couldn't beat the sea peoples in an open sea battle. He had to lure them into his trap. He lined the banks of the Nile Delta with thousands of archers, hidden behind reed screens. He filled the river with his own ships, packed with elite marines. When the Sea People's fleet entered the narrow, shallow waters of the Delta, they found themselves in a kill zone. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't retreat. The Egyptian relics at Medinet Habu describe the scene in gruesome detail. The pharaoh's archers rained down a wall of arrows. The invaders' ships were capsized, their warriors dragged to the shore and executed. It was a massacre. Against all odds, Egypt did the impossible. They defeated the invincible Sea Peoples. They saved the Nile. But it was a hollow victory. The war had bankrupted the empire. The trade routes they defended were now empty. The Brotherhood of Kings was dead. Egypt had survived the storm, but it was now an island of stone in a sea of ghosts. The Bronze Age was over, the lights were out, and the Great Dark was about to begin. After the fires of 1177 BC died down, a terrifying silence fell over the world. This was the Long Dark. It is one of the few times in human history where we didn't just stop progressing, we went backward. In Greece, the change was total. The grand palaces were replaced by small, mud brick huts. The gold jewelry was replaced by crude iron. Most hauntingly, the relics of writing, the tablets of Linear B, simply vanished. For nearly 400 years, the Greeks became illiterate. The stories of the Trojan War and the great kings were no longer written down. They were whispered around campfires, slowly turning into the myths we know today. Across the sea, the once mighty Hittite Empire was forgotten so completely that until the 19th century, modern historians didn't even believe they existed. Their great stone capital, Hattusa, became a ghost city, inhabited only by the wind. The international trade that had brought tin from the east and copper from the west was severed. Small, isolated villages became the new reality. Globalization had failed, and in its place was a world of walls and fear. But in this darkness, the seeds of the future were being planted. Because the supply of tin was cut off, smiths could no longer make bronze. They were forced to experiment with a difficult, stubborn metal that was more common but harder to work: iron. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age was being forged in the dark. The world was resetting. The old gods were dead, and the stage was being cleared for the rise of Rome, the Phoenicians, and the world we recognize today. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not just a relic of history, it is a mirror. We look back at 1177 BC and see a world much like our own, hyper-connected, technologically advanced, and deeply dependent on global trade. They believed they were too big to fail. They believed their complexity was their strength, only to find out it was their greatest weakness. As we look at the ruins of Mycenae, or the burnt layers of Ugarit, we are reminded that civilization is a fragile thing. It is a thin veneer held together by trust, climate, and the steady flow of resources. The Bronze Age didn't end because of one villain. It ended because a dozen small problems happened all at once. The collapse was a perfect storm. When the trade routes of the Mediterranean snapped, the lights didn't just go out in the palaces, they went out in the minds of the people. Writing, which had been the backbone of empire, was abandoned. For nearly 4 centuries, the Greeks became illiterate. The Hittites vanished from memory, and the great pharaohs became legends rather than men. History had been replaced by myth. We call this a dark age, but it was also a reset. From the ashes of the Bronze Age emerged something more resilient. Without the fall of the Old World, the New World, the world of Homer, of the Iron Age, and eventually our own world, could never have been born. But as we stand in the shadow of our own global connectivity, we must ask, are we building a world that can survive the storm? Or are we simply the next great layer of ash waiting for a future historian to find? The citizens of Ugarit and Mycenae did not know they were living in the final days of an era. To them, the world was stable, the ships were constant, and the gods were in their temples. They were blind to the fragility of their own greatness until the first city burned. Today, our bronze is silicon and oil. Our trade routes are fiber optic cables and satellite links. We are more connected than Ramses could have ever dreamed, but that connectivity is a double-edged sword. When one link breaks, the whole chain shudders. History tells us that collapse is not an end, but a transformation. The question is not if the storm will come, but who we will be when the dust settles. Will we be the ones who let the fire consume us, or will we be the architects of what comes next? Thank you for joining us on this journey through the dust of the past. If you found value in this deep dive, subscribe to Relic of History and hit the bell icon. We don't just tell stories, we exhume the truth. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting to be rediscovered.